Hello everyone, welcome to my first video of this style. This is a book video, if you couldn't tell from the title when you clicked on it, and these are my top 10 books from 22. Just to give this some context, I read I think 190 books this year, or thereabouts. If you want, you can go look on my Goodreads and correct me, it'll be linked in the description. It's also important to note that these are all books I read for the first time, because I did not count rereads when I made up this list, because they would have been on maybe a favorites from years past or whatever, so I didn't count them on this list. We're gonna do least favorite to favorite out of the top 10. So we're gonna start with number 10 and work our way to number 1, because that seems more climatic. Coming in at 10th place, we have Slave to Sensation by Nalini Singh. I believe that's how I pronounce it. I apologize if I pronounce anything wrong throughout this whole video. And that one is the very start of her Psy Changeling series. And it's basically, there's the Psy who have like mental powers and have a whole network, and it's like a hive mind almost. And then there's the changelings who have an animal form also, so they're basically shapeshifters, but they can only shapeshift into one animal. And so this is the first in that series, and it takes a Psy who is sort of on the outs with the Psy, and it puts her with a changeling. Obviously it's a romance and they end up falling in love, but I won't give you any more details because I don't want to spoil anything. But the reason this one made my list is because this whole series was a huge part of my reading this year. I don't know how many books exactly are in it, but a lot. I spent a good portion of my year reading these books off and on. I actually read some of them twice within like a month of each other because I liked them so much. So this is like a fantasy romance, if that's what you're looking for. Actually, I believe it's called paranormal romance. Coming in at number 9, we have Everything for You by Chloe Liese. Liese? I'm not sure, and I apologize. This is part of her Bergman Brothers series. This is, I believe, the youngest brother who plays soccer. When you first meet him, he's in college and playing soccer on a college team, but in this book he's playing soccer on a professional team, and he's playing with someone who he admired for a lot of years, and it's an MM romance, so obviously you can kind of figure that out, what that means, but he's gonna fall in love with this person on this team, and it's just like that love story. And it was a really sweet love story. It's an enemies to lovers, which made me happy. I like that. And it's like Grumpy Sunshine. Coming in at number 8, we actually don't have a romance book. This was The Late Show by Michael Connelly, and this is the first in his Detective Renee Ballard series. This is a build-off of the Harry Bosch universe, if you've ever read that. Michael Connelly is just such a prolific mystery writer and detective fiction writer, and it was just really such a good read, and it grips you and it brings you into this case. This one was a very good read, and it was just fun to see something different than a romance, for one, and for two, to have the world building and the case and all of these details that you're trying to figure out as the detective is trying to figure out. Coming in at number 7, we have Hunt the Stars by Jessie Mihalik, and this is a futuristic sci-fi romance, and it's an alien-human romance. This alien team and this human team have to come together, and the captains of both teams have to work closely together, and they're the ones who end up falling in love. And they're working toward this mission. Some conspiracy is going on. It's a good read that has the romance as a forefront, but also a really interesting and gripping plot. And this one sent me down a rabbit hole of reading. I read literally all of Jessie Mihalik's books that are currently out, which is an entire trilogy, plus the second book in this series this year after reading this one. It was a very enjoyable read. It was fun, it was light, but it also has this element of plot that you miss in some romances because they're all so predictable. Coming in at number 6, we have Under Locke by Mariana Zapata. and this is a tattoo artist and his assistant. I believe the tattoo artist was in a motorcycle gang previously, and it's like Grumpy Sunshine, Age Gap, and there are other Mariana Zapata books that would have made my list had I read them this past year. However, I started reading her books in December of 2021, so some of those were not eligible based on my conditions for the 2022 list. But this was my favorite one that I read for the first time by her, and I'm actually planning to reread it this year. It's a fun read. That's why it made it at number 6. At number 5, we actually have a young adult book. It's Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber, and I adore her books. Like, they have my heart. I love her books so much. I read the entire Caraval series. It's a sort of a new trilogy, but it's in the same world as her Caraval series. It was just fun to return to that world because Stephanie Garber writes phenomenal worlds and does great world building that it makes it so interesting to read these books. And this is the story actually of Jax and a girl named Evangeline. And so I can't say too much without spoiling the Caraval series. So if you haven't read that, go read that. Those ones definitely have been on my top 10 list in the past. But I love this series. I would definitely sort of recommend reading the Caraval series before starting this one because there is some context that you need, and that's just like helpful to be like, oh yeah, like I remember this happening in that series. But you could definitely get away with just starting this series and not reading the Caraval series also. Personally, I loved Jax as a character in the Caraval series. He's just fun and kind of villainous and evil, and it's like good girl falls for the evil boy kind of thing. It looks like the road we're headed down. I haven't read anything more than Once Upon a Broken Heart, but I do have The Ballad of Never After, and I will be reading that this year. Number 4 is The Love Hypothesis by Hazelwood. This is sort of a different romance. You don't see too many romances like this, and the reason it's so different is because it's based in a science workplace. In this one, it's Olive, and I believe Adam is his name, and it's a fake dating book where they get together because she's trying to convince one of her friends that she's moved on from her ex-boyfriend, and a bunch of reasons like that. Like, you know how these things get started. There's a good balance of like spice and story, and it just brings it all together and makes it a really good read. To start off our top 3, we have at number 3, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. This is another mystery. This one is by Steig Larsson, and it just kind of, it pulled me in and I could not stop reading, and I raved about it to my friends and was like, you have to read this. And I got into a conversation with my Spanish professor in Spanish, and I was like, yeah, this is the book I'm reading. She was like, oh wow, like I read this one in Spanish like a couple years ago. It was amazing. And I was like, yeah, it's amazing. And it was a very gripping story, and I will say that. But the way I felt when I was reading it, I was just like completely in the story. Number 2, we have Broken French by Tasha Boyd. This is one that I don't think is as popular as some of the other ones I've had on my list, and it's actually nanny romance with the billionaire father of this girl that she's nannying, and she goes on this trip with them on a boat because they're going on a yacht for like the summer in France, I think. And oh yeah, that's why it's called Broken French. It's in France. That's kind of kicked me off into that kind of, it's an age gap, and that's kind of kicked me off into that kind of romance, and I went down that rabbit hole for a while. And finally, drum roll, coming in at number 1, we have Kiss of Snow by Nalini Singh. This brings us back to her Psy changeling world, and this is the story of, if you read any of them, it's Hawk and Sienna. I read this book twice in the past year. I read it in April and May of last year, and I have plans to read it again this year. I love it so much, and this is actually like the 10th book in this series. When I told you I went down a rabbit hole with this series, I was not lying. I just absolutely loved this one, partially I think because it was very anticipated, and I had been waiting for us to get to this point because they had foreshadowed it in books before for this couple to get together, and it was so enjoyable. I loved this book, and obviously I read it twice and went back and reread scenes and certain things like that while I still had my loan from the library. And so that is why that book is number one, and I already could probably read it again and then again and again and again. That's how I feel about that book. That's all of them. Thank you so much for watching. I run a book talk account, which I'll put the name up here, and it should actually be linked in the description below. And I also have an Instagram that you can follow, which is also linked down below. You can follow me on Goodreads and keep up to date with all that I'm reading. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.